You have to understand the war on drugs has never been about drugs.
U.S. customs officers and police are having another drive to round up dope smugglers. Here's millions of dollars worth of deadly heroin, enough, they say, to kill 6 million people.
Looking to find out more about the longer history of drugs in America, I found an unlikely source in Lincoln historian Richard Miller. His research put drug laws in a fascinating historical context.
Historically, anti-drug laws have always been associated with race. In the 1800s, certain kinds of drugs that are illicit today were common in this country. Cocaine was widely used, heroin. People using drugs was something that was just ordinarily accepted. Opium, for example, was used by middle-aged, successful whites, often housewives in the South. If people were addicted or abusing drugs, they were viewed sympathetically as people who had to be helped. It was seen as a public health issue rather than a crime issue. Well, one of the first changes was on the West Coast, when smoking opium was made a criminal offense. Now, why would opium smoking be illegal in California but not in Mississippi? What was going on in California that was a concern about smoking opium? Well, as it turns out, it had nothing to do with opium itself. The concern was with the people associated with smoking opium, and that was the Chinese who had come to this country, and many of whom were in California, working hard, working for very little pay, and becoming part of the American success story. But their success was taking jobs away from white workers. So politicians got together and decided they got to find something about the Chinese for which they can be criminalized to get them out of the way. Now, of course, you can't throw people in jail simply because they're Chinese, but you can throw them in jail because they smoke opium. In the same way, we saw things going on with cocaine. Again, it was middle-aged, successful people in this country, business executives, physicians, housewives, all perfectly legal. But then around the turn of the century, cocaine began being associated with blacks. They could withstand police bullets, it was thought. They can work hard all day, all night long, and all day long again, threatening the jobs of white workers. And so laws began to be passed against cocaine. You're not arresting these people officially because they're black. You're arresting them because they've committed some sort of drug violation. Next, of course, we see the change in reputation that hemp has had. Hemp was a legitimate crop from colonial times forward, a widely appreciated commercial product. But then in the 1930s, hemp changed into something vicious and fearsome called marijuana, because at that time, marijuana smoking was being associated with Mexicans, working hard, working cheap. And once again, what was being outlawed was not being Mexican, but just some habit associated with Mexicans. These laws set up a very dangerous precedent of racial control.
It seemed that time and again, drug laws targeted any immigrant group seen as a threat to the established economic order. But how then did Black Americans, who came to this country over 200 years ago, become the primary target of drug laws in the modern era?
Well, the way to think about African American history in the 20th century is as an immigrant story. I mean, the transition from the rural to the urban, it's one of the great mass migrations in the history of the world.
When blacks came out of slavery, they were heavily concentrated in the South in farming-type jobs. As industries were expanding in the North, blacks were recruited to come to work in factories. This gave rise to the great migration of blacks flowing into urban areas.
Before she came to work for my family, Nanny Jeter had joined the wave of Black Americans who'd moved north during the Great Migration. She took me down to her childhood home in Southern Virginia.
We grew up rumbling through the woods with a beautiful outside life. The old Victoria would play and somebody would square dance, and it was a completely different world. I love life in the South.
Now, in that environment that seems so wonderful in the South, why did you ever decide you wanted to leave the South?
I left the South because I had to. Jim Crow, during that time, you couldn't, black people, if they was raped, they couldn't say they was raped. So you never hear of rape. Only the white lady got raped, but the black woman, I was innocent, but people didn't think I was innocent. No one knew I was leaving. I wanted to bring my children up different. North was the way out. I thought it would make a big difference.
Nanny had never spoken so openly about her past and what it was that had compelled her north. But as I learned more about her life, I began to see the deeper roots of the drug war for Black American families like Nanny's.
Sadly, what many of these families came to find is that they had not really escaped Jim Crow at all, but found themselves in a new system of racial control, a new Jim Crow. Racially discriminatory laws across America ensured that poor people of color migrating from the South would be confined to certain parts of the city that we now think of as ghettos.
Very few people know this, but if you go back and you look at how African-American housing patterns were established in the 30s and 40s, even as a result of the New Deal, the FHA, which was a Democratic New Deal program to inspire home ownership in the midst of the Depression, did more to create ghettos than any other federal program before or since. Why? Because when they were creating the culture of home ownership in America, they were exclusionary to Black people. They put them in the areas that were maybe a little bit economically depressed and subject to heavy rentership. And then they redlined those areas and they would not write FHA mortgages in those neighborhoods. Once those areas were redlined, that was basically a design for a ghetto.
In 1950, people in these neighborhoods were poor, but they had jobs. By 1960, we're talking about the jobless poor, because industries had moved out of the inner city, leaving behind concentrated populations of poor people, vulnerable to drug trafficking and all of the other problems associated with joblessness.
And what happens when groups are denied access to the core economic engines in a society? They create their own out of prohibited economies. That was true of the Italians and the Irish and the Jews and everybody else who came to the cities a generation before African Americans arrived.
In 1969, during that time, I couldn't get a job. It was like all the doors were shut. When I came to work for your parents, I was happy just to have this job.
Do you remember the first time you saw me?
Yes. It was about 3 days old when your mom brought you home from the hospital. That was the first time I seen you. You were a beautiful baby that I fell in love with. You became my baby. I loved your family. I guess I never dreamt that you guys would ever leave New Haven.
I've always known that when I was very young, my family's circumstances improved, and we moved from Connecticut, where my dad had been a doctor, to a comfortable suburb of New York City, where he'd started a successful business. What I didn't know was how this had impacted Nanny and her family.
Your mom, she said, my husband's gonna double your pay if you can go with us. I felt more money would make a better life for my family. Eugene, that was the wrong thing to do. I was always working in New York whilst my kids were in New Haven. My youngest son, James, he started smoking marijuana at 14, and at 20, he started to really go into drugs. It is so amazing how you spend your life providing, loving your kids that you don't see the mental part that's going on in their life. In turn, then you look at white kids, they have their parent and they have a housekeeper that loves them, but yet still your kids are most of the time alone.
And what happened with James?
He got, he died with AIDS from use, needles.
As Nanny and I returned to New Haven together, I suddenly saw my birthplace with new eyes, processing so much I hadn't understood about the intersection of James's life and my own. But what else had I missed?